Hey, everybody, and welcome to a special webinar on enterprise IoT and OT 2023 trends and threats. I'm your host from Inside.com, Stephanie Zielinski, and today we are going to hear from Jitin Nair and Will Seaton. Jitin is a senior manager and security researcher at Zscaler, and Will is a senior product marketing manager at Zscaler's Threat Labs. Threat Labs is a very cool threat intelligence and security research arm of Zscaler, which is the world's largest cloud security platform. The research team analyzed data from this platform, processing the over 300 billion transactions that happen daily to uncover the latest IoT and OT device threats and trends. They've created a report that focuses on enterprise IoT and OT threats, and we are going to be discussing that today and learning a lot. So I want to welcome on Jitin and Will. Hi, guys. Thanks for being here.
Hi, Stephanie. Thanks for the warm welcome.
Yes, Stephanie, thank you for having us.
Of course. So you guys are both in California, and I'm curious about how you got started at Zscaler.
So I have been with Zscaler for over 8 years.
Oh, wow.
I have been in this security industry for over 15 years, working with multiple antivirus as well as network security products.
Okay. Will, how did your career lead to Zscaler and working with Threat Labs today?
Before this, I was working in open source security with a tool called Open Policy Agent, also dealing with large enterprise challenges of security. So it was a really natural segue into working on Zero Trust.
Yeah, amazing. The work that Threat Labs does is so cool. So I'll go ahead and invite you guys to pull up your presentation, and I know we're going to learn a lot today.
With that, we'll dive in. As Stephanie mentioned, we're super excited to today talk about some of our findings from our latest enterprise IoT and OT threat report. IoT, obviously, the Internet of Things, the smartwatches, cameras, TVs, routers, digital barcode readers that accelerate business, but which nonetheless are often the target of threats. Stephanie, you gave a great overview of Threat Labs, but just to kind of reiterate, this is, again, the security research arm of Zscaler. We have about 150 threat researchers and security researchers worldwide. And as you mentioned, we're fortunate to draw from the world's largest security cloud. So as Stephanie mentioned, we're seeing about 300 billion requests a day and 9 billion blocked threats. And so any time a new threat or an existing threat touches the Zscaler cloud, that's automatically federated to every other user and customer. So there's this cloud effect for security, and we're able to draw on that really large, diverse data set to deliver research and insights around different threat trends. And today we're talking about IoT, which brings us to our biggest finding overall. When we're looking at malware targeting IoT, we saw a pretty substantial year-over-year increase of about 400%, which to me feels quite large. Jitin, I would love to know if you have any context or color about why we're seeing such a large number there.
Yep, sure, Will. So a major reason for this would be the recent adoption of these IoT devices. Now, as the number of devices start increasing, the attack surface would also increase. And most of these IoT devices, they also have the default passwords enabled. They are not updated frequently. There are a lot of vulnerabilities being disclosed for these IoT devices. And the attackers, they are taking advantage of all these default settings and vulnerabilities, and then using these IoT devices for creating a botnet. And then that's the major reason for us seeing this huge increase in the volume of malwares blocked.
Yep, I think that's absolutely on target, and I think that really tracks to the data that we're seeing. So before we dive in, I want to give some brief context around what are the risks of IoT in general. I think this is really a situation of risk versus reward for enterprises. And when thinking about IT, the biggest challenges enterprises face today are that, number one, it tends to be really limited or fragmented visibility into devices. There's a huge volume and diversity of different devices connected to enterprise networks, and it's really hard for enterprises to have a full picture. Thinking about BYOD, unmanaged devices, what's called shadow IoT devices to get that full picture. Number two, there are strides being made in this area, but to date, there really is still no standard security standard or protocols for IoT security. These devices are really lightweight, low computational power. They can't host traditional agents. They can often be difficult to patch, weak encryption, which presents security challenges. And kind of as a result, there's really no way to centrally or holistically apply security controls across all of these different different unique IoT products. So this is an ongoing challenge that I think that most organizations face. We're going to talk about a close cousin of IoT, which is OT, operational technology. These are the oftentimes large critical infrastructure systems you see in places like the energy sector or industrial manufacturing that are increasingly connected to the internet. So, Jinton, if you wouldn't mind just kind
Mhm.
of giving a picture of the general risks of OT.
Yep. So historically, these OT environments, they have been air gapped, tightly air gapped, and then isolated from the outside no, internet. But now, this as they are becoming more and more digitalized and connected to the internet, now they are becoming more susceptible to this malware, ransomwares, and other supply chain attacks. And then initiatives to modernize the factories and connect these OT IoT devices over the internet. They are exposing these devices to the threats which are over internet. Now, another important aspect here is that these devices, they need remote access. So third-party workers as well as no, remote workers, they need third-party access or say remote access to these devices so that they can perform maintenance of these device. They can perform repair, any kind of repair work associated with this device. They can perform the monitoring of this device. And traditionally, this remote access has been granted using virtual private networks. Now, VPNs, they are difficult to manage and have various security flows associated with these devices. Now, they can easily be bypassed by attackers taking advantage of the inherent trust. And once they are able to, say, pop a VPN, they are able to freely propagate laterally in the network, thereby accessing these IoT devices and compromising these OT IoT devices. And then the third aspect would be that these assets, most of these OT assets are traditional and they are not patchable and often don't get patches from the vendors on a regular basis. And in some of the cases, they even cannot be taken offline because of their significance in the production line. So, due to all of these reasons, there are high chance that the attackers will try to exploit a vulnerability on one of these exposed OT assets.
Yep, I think those things are absolutely true. I think one thing we see in general is that with digital transformation, connectivity can really be a double-edged sword. And as you expose more of these systems to the internet, they also become discoverable and therefore compromisable. So now we're going to dive into our findings a little bit. Here we're going to give a picture, kind of the IoT landscape. What are the kinds of devices that are connecting to organizational networks and environments, and what are the trends that we're seeing here? And so overall, to deliver the study, we were able to capture 3 trillion IoT device transactions over three months, covering over 850 unique device types and around 30 general IoT device categories. So painting a pretty comprehensive view into these trends that we're seeing. Overall, we're seeing that over half of devices that are connecting to enterprises are in fact consumer devices, which is what you'd expect. But I think that for enterprises, this makes it more challenging to have a fuller picture of what devices are in fact operating in their environments, and as by the same measure, how to secure them. Overall, over 60% of IoT device transactions are encrypted with SSL and TLS, which is a positive trend. We're seeing more and more encryption over time, which is a good sign. The vast majority of the traffic is we're seeing routed to the US. I think this is pretty consistent with the United States having a really mature digital infrastructure, and many sectors in the US, particularly manufacturing, who have really leaned into the adoption of IoT devices. So that's kind of where that trend is coming from. Overall, about 90% of the traffic is being driven by just three sectors: manufacturing, retail, and enterprise traffic. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is, particularly in manufacturing. One of the reasons is overall in manufacturing, we're seeing over 7,000 unique devices that are active in this environment. So that's part of the reason. And the second reason is that 52% of overall transactions are coming from data collection terminals. What are data collection terminals? These are the wireless barcode scanners that are common for scanning items, manufacturing settings in places like retail, which drive an enormous amount of traffic. So the top IoT devices, or the most common IoT devices that we're observing, as you might expect, are in fact consumer devices. things like set-top boxes, which enable televisions to connect to the internet. Overall, this is the most common IoT device we're seeing worldwide. Smart TVs, which are, as anyone who's been in any corporate setting knows, these are pretty pervasive in the environment as well as at home. Smartwatches, obviously, pretty common BYOD device. I have one. They tend to be more secure, but they also do host, critical data for the enterprise and in many cases. And digital media players, right, which enable the playback of multimedia content. These can pose a security risk. They're less common that, people are thinking about these devices from a security perspective, and they're more likely to have things like default credentials. And then, as we discussed, data terminals, data collection terminals, extremely common in the enterprises. So here we have a snapshot of the top devices sending traffic, IoT traffic. And as I just mentioned, you're going to see things like set-top boxes, smart TVs, data collection terminals. But I think this also paints a picture of the diversity of devices that are extremely common in enterprise environments. You've got game consoles, printers, digital signage, media players, e-readers, IP cameras, geolocation trackers. I think when you think about the security challenge of managing all of these devices, this paints a clear picture of why that is. And here we have the number of unique devices by industry. As we mentioned, manufacturing is blowing it out of the park with over 7,600 unique devices observed in our study. In manufacturing, that's a really substantial number. And just as that is, enabling business. One of the terms we hear around manufacturing is Industry 4.0 transformation. So it's clear from this data that manufacturers really are leading into the adoption of connected devices to drive efficiencies, but by the same token, that's also expanding their attack surface. At the same time, industries like services, retail, and wholesale, finance, education still have over 2,000 unique devices in those environments, which is still quite a substantial number, even if it isn't as high as manufacturing. Overall, in terms of encryption, we're seeing really positive trends here. Overall, more than 60% of IoT device traffic is in fact encrypted with SSL or TLS. But at the same time, that still means that 37% of traffic is still in plain text. And with plain text traffic, it's obviously easier to intercept data, data leakage is more common and is more likely to have some sort of unauthorized access. And as we see by different sectors, there are really stark differences in the amount of encrypted traffic that we're seeing. In places like healthcare, where there's a ton of sensitive patient data, PII, we're seeing almost all traffic is in fact encrypted. But in the enterprise, still more than 70% of traffic is in plain text, and in entertainment and home automation, that's even higher at 85%. I'll add a little bit of color here, though. In our 2021 study, just 2 years ago, we saw that 75% of IoT traffic was still in plain text. So it's clear that enterprises and manufacturers have huge strides here to encrypt transactions. Another note I'll make here is that in December, we'll be releasing our State of Encrypted Attacks report. And so it's important to note that the large majority of attacks still do happen over encrypted channels. So even as IoT device traffic is increasingly encrypted, there's still a need to inspect that traffic for threats. And here, I'll hand it over to you, Jitin, to kind of walk us through the IoT threats that we're seeing.
Sure, Will. Can you please move to the next slide?
Yep.
Thank you. So, as we have already seen, so we have seen around 400% of growth in the IoT malware attacks, out of which we saw around 350 plus unique block payloads. And this shows the diversity of the IoT malware landscape. And then around 67% of these attacks, they were targeted at routers. Now, one of the primary reasons could be the work from home adoption after the COVID. Now, there are a lot of people who are working from home. They were having internet access and then routers. They were inherently an easy way to get into the corporate network by targeting one of these routers. If they have a VPN device, they can even get into the corporate network using that, exploiting one of the VPN vulnerabilities. And then, as we see, so 55% of these attacks were targeted at manufacturing. One of the major reasons could be that manufacturing was employing the most number of devices. So that's the reason we are seeing more attacks targeted at manufacturing. And another important aspect is that 34 out of 39 vulnerabilities we saw which were exploited by these malware were legacy vulnerabilities, which means that those were disclosed more than 3 years back. So this also proves that a lot of these devices aren't being patched, and that's the reason they are even able to use vulnerabilities which are disclosed in 2017, 2018, 2019 to exploit these devices and get an initial foothold into the network. 74% or almost three-fourth of the attacks we saw, they exploited the command injection CWE. Uh, so what it means is that they were trying to execute a command so that they're able to download additional payloads and additional scripts into this malware so that they can execute additional payloads so that uh, they can create a botnet out of these IoT devices. Now, if you take a look at the major malware families which we saw, Mirai and GAFKit, they are pretty known malware families. Has been there in the wild since 2016. 2016 was when Mirai was developed by three teenagers. And after that, I think in around 2017, mid of 2017, they have even leaked this source code onto the internet, thereby a lot of script kiddies and other people taking the source code. They are developing their own custom command and control servers, and then using that to infect additional IoT devices. That's the reason we are seeing that Mirai and GAFKit, they accounted for almost 66% of these attack payloads. Uh, Most of these IoT malwares, they were trying to create a botnet, and most of these botnets would be used for performing a DOS or DDoS kind of attacks. Another important malware family which we saw was called Botana Go. Now, Botana Go, it's written in the Go programming language, which is the Google open source programming language, and hence the name Botana Go. It employs around 33 exploit functions, targeting around 15 plus vendors, which means that once it is able to infiltrate a network, so then it can scan the entire network and try to exploit these 33 vulnerabilities and multiple devices such as routers, modems, NAS devices. So they had support for all of these devices. So if any one of those devices have any kind of default password enabled or any kind of vulnerabilities which were not patched, then this particular malware could exploit that and then again use that as an infection vector. Uh, Another malware family which could be of significance is Celex. So it used to exploit the weak or default credentials to quickly threat. But another aspect for this malware was that it used to brick the IoT device, or no, it used to wipe the firmware so that the device is not usable for the users. Uh, Around 67% of the malware attacks we saw targeted at routers. Now, since routers they are present almost everywhere, so it used to provide an easy infection vector. And then we also saw a lot of router-based vulnerabilities which were disclosed during the past couple of years. That could be another reason for these IoT malwares targeting these router devices. Now, in addition to routers, we also saw cameras, DVRs, VPNs, other firewall devices being exploited by these IoT malwares. Yeah. And so around we mentioned about the percentage of attacks we are seeing related to manufacturing. Now, another important field where we saw these attacks significantly increasing was the education sector. So around 960 percentage of attacks were now we saw an increase in the education sector. And most of this could be again now since this education sector they are also adapting to these IoT devices, but IoT's security, it is being given a least preference. So they would just get these IoT devices put onto the network without changing any kind of default settings or without changing the default passwords. So that's the reason we are also seeing this huge increase in the attacks targeting this education sector.
Yeah, I think that's great. One of the, you often hear that education is considered in some ways a soft target, just for the reasons you mentioned. That as education sector enables things like remote learning and employing so many new IoT devices. You know, while at the same time there's there's not always as much paid attention to the security aspect of that. And so now we're going to dive into some best practices, right? We don't want to present these threats to you and leave you, and just say best of luck. We want to, give a little bit of best practice advice that any enterprise can follow to improve their IoT and OT security. So, looking at IoT security best practices, this is a set of 8 best practices. I won't read through them all, but I'll just cover a couple important callouts. I think number one, visibility. Security starts with visibility, right? You can't really protect what you don't know. And as we mentioned, there's so many different devices operating in enterprise networks, so many devices patching that need to be aware of credential management. If you don't have that visibility first, then it's hard for you to take next steps around security. As I just mentioned, protecting credentials is so critical. So many attacks targeting just to pull up credentials. It's really essential that enterprises protect administrative credentials and enable things like multi-factor authentication to have an added layer of security to authentication to those devices. Number three, stand patching. As Jitin mentioned, 34 of the most common attacks are targeting legacy vulnerabilities. So attackers are really counting on enterprises not patching these systems, right, to making them really easy targets and known targets for attackers. I'll jump to number 7. This is just a really important, best practice, for Zscaler, and I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean in a minute. But implementing a zero trust security architecture really is, we feel, the best way for organizations to protect this diversity of IoT OT devices. So, Jitin, I'll leave it to you to talk us through some OT security recommendations.
Sure, Will. So both OT and IoT devices, you should basically eliminate the implicit trust associated with the users as well as the devices. Now, you should basically enforce segmentation with least privilege access to ensure that users and devices can only access what they need. They can basically enforce this by creating a zero trust security architecture. And then you can use that to minimize your attack surface and eliminate any kind of lateral movement. No, we also saw that the remote access was one of the important aspects for these IoT and OT devices, and Zscaler provides a option for accessing or an option for this remote access using Zscaler Privileged Remote Access. This is a cloud-delivered zero trust access solution that enables fast, secure, and reliable connectivity to these OT and IoT devices. The privileged remote access provides remote workers and third-party vendors with a clientless remote desktop access to critical production systems without having to install any kind of agents in their unmanaged devices. And the Zscaler privilege access, it will also boost uptime productivity. You will be able to increase the plant and people safety, and it also delivers an exceptional user experience. From any HTML5 capable web browsers like Chrome, Safari, Edge, the users can go to the Zscaler privileged remote access and will be able to not do any kind of say RDP or SSH or VNC into these OT IoT devices so that they can monitor and perform any kind of maintenance activities. Another important aspect is that during the session, if the user wants to upload or download any kind of files to these OT devices, you also have an option of configuring the Zscaler Cloud Sandbox, Advanced Cloud Sandbox, so that the files being uploaded are first inspected by the sandbox. Now, once Zscaler Cloud Sandbox analyzes and comes up with a benign verdict, then only the users will be able to upload the files to these OT devices. Now, this would be another important aspect for preventing any kind of infection on these OT devices and making sure that the users are not uploading any kind of malicious files onto these OT devices, thereby impacting the production.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely perfect. Thanks, Jitin. And so now I'll kind of cover what we've mentioned is zero trust architecture. And so I'll just talk to you a little bit what we mean by that and why that's important in the context of IoT and OT. And again, we're talking a little bit about Zscaler here, but I think that these are really best practices any organization should look for, as they're evaluating how to secure their IoT and OT devices. In contrast to, in general, in IoT, we see that all of these devices are connecting to legacy networks, right? So if these devices are compromised, it provides an opportunity for an attacker to scan the network to find other critical assets, move laterally, and to steal data. Well, the zero trust architecture takes a different view, and it says, rather than connecting to the network, you should instead enable connectivity through a single cloud proxy architecture, right? You can think of this as like a intelligent switchboard that enables direct connectivity, for instance, between users and applications, or for IoT, or between cloud workloads. And what that allows you to do is provide a consistent layers of security to every connection, right? So no connection is ever made unless these layers of security are verified, right? Verifying identity, evaluating risk, evaluating policy, and only then creating that connection. And there are certain virtues of this architecture that, in the context of IoT and OT, are really important. Number one is because this cloud proxy sits between connectivity, it makes it really, really easy for you to discover all of the IoT devices that are connecting to your environment, right? Including your managed devices, but also including BYOD devices, unmanaged devices, shadow IoT devices, different servers, right, that you may or may not be aware of or securing. And then and then in the context of OT, as Jiten just mentioned, right, it's enabling things like privileged remote access without the need to expose something like a VPN or firewall to the internet. And I think this is the most important point, is because you're hiding, you're enabling connectivity through the zero trust architecture that allows you to hide all of your OT devices, right? All of your IoT devices, all of your OT devices and networks from the public internet, creating inside out connections only, right? So there's no ability for any sort of attacker to scan through your environment to find different devices that may be vulnerable in order to exploit them, right? There's no real way to know that those even exist, right? So this is a critical line of defense and a fundamentally, we think, better way to think about IoT and OT security. So summing up this kind of last section, what does this mean for enterprises taking these best practices? Well, number one, it helps you eliminate those blind spots in IoT, by discovering all of those devices, servers, unmanaged devices. Number two, it enables these devices to communicate with the internet safely, right? For any sort of cloud-based controllers, for any sort of software updates that need to happen, right? While at the same time blocking known communication with any command and control sites. So that's critical. The third point, and I didn't even discuss this yet, but this architecture, enabling direct connectivity between users and applications, makes it really, really easy to segment user and application traffic, right? So this is your internal attack surface, the ability for attackers to move laterally on your network. It really minimizes or eliminates that, right? There's no, even if an IoT device is compromised, if you segment that traffic, there's no way for an attacker to be able to discover other applications, critical assets that they would be able to move to. And so now we're going to wrap things up with some predictions. It's, we're getting into November. It's holiday season. It's prediction season. So we're gonna give you some of these. I think that the first one, that we're seeing, this is sort of, maybe obvious, but I think IoT devices will just continue to be a primary threat vector. Consistent with the 400% increase we saw this year, and including and especially routers, right? As Jitin mentioned, we've seen numerous news stories across, over the course of the year about new vulnerabilities and 0 days disclosed for routers. So that will continue to be a trend for sure. Manufacturing, again, will continue to be a prime target for IoT malware. Again, as the manufacturing adds more devices, the attack surface there only grows. So we're likely to continue. And the third is that is around generative AI. So we feel that these technologies will enable and empower more targeted IoT attacks. Now, it's not that generative AI tools really give attackers any sort of threat types that didn't really exist before AI, but it's really democratizing access to those kinds of threats. It makes it much easier for even low-level attackers to spin out more advanced, more sophisticated targeted attacks at greater scale. So that's definitely a trend that we're keeping an eye on. And with that, we're going to close things out. This is just a snapshot today of our report. So if you're curious about more IoT landscape trends and threat trends, really encourage you to download the rest of the report. There's a lot of great information there. You can scan this QR code if you like, or there's also a link you can access. And again, both of us, we love DMs on LinkedIn if you have further questions and want to follow up. With that, just want to thank everyone for their time. Yeah, thanks so much.
Amazing. Thank you, Will and Jitin. Okay, could you return to that prediction slide? Because obviously AI is
Yes.
the hot topic right now. Are you kind of implying that bad actors will be able to use the intelligence of AI to learn how to better attack? Is that where it's going?
Yeah, I
Yes.
mean, so just
And
go
maybe
ahead, Jen.
Jitin
Yeah.
should
Yeah.
take that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
Sure,
no.
Stephanie. So we have been seeing a rise in the attacks using the AI capabilities. So since AI also have provision to generate code, so we have
Right.
also seen users using that particular functionality to even create malicious code. So rather than creating a complete malware, so what they would do is that they would create sections of code which would perform these actions and then stitch together those code generated by this AI to create the malware.
That's interesting. Wherever there's something good for humanity, someone's always going to use it
Yep.
in a bad way. Will, would you return to slide 12, please?
Yes. Let me jump back.
Thanks.
Yep.
In this slide, you guys pointed out how encrypted a lot of the data in the healthcare industry is, and this is so much due to regulation. I'm thinking about the financial sector. I know regulation is hard to keep up with, but do you predict that regulation will increase, requiring other sectors to have more encrypted data as well?
That's a great question. Jitin, I don't know if you have any color there. I don't know that, we're in a place of, predicting where regulations will go, but this is absolutely the trend that more, enterprises and, in particular sectors like finance will move to encrypt more of their traffic. So, in either case, whether that's regulation or whether that's, a drive from enterprises pushing for this, IoT device manufacturers pushing for this, that we'll definitely expect to see more of that.
Jitin, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so for most of these financial sectors, it would be imperative for them to move to a SSL or encrypted traffic because most of this deals with financial data, right? So anyone, say, performing a man-in-the-middle attack or say listening into the network, they would be able to gather the details. So most of them would obviously be doing the SSL traffic, but since we are not seeing those many devices associated with financial sector, that might be one of the reasons we are not seeing that in the major distribution.
Mhm. Okay, and my last question, if you could go to slide 19, Will.
Sure.
So, Jitin, for enterprise companies that are looking at number 4 and they're saying, okay, I need to do this entirely new security framework, is it possible to migrate really old systems into this new type of framework?
Yes, definitely. So, whenever we say IoT security framework, we are basically saying that you should be trying to deploy any kind of zero trust security architecture and reduce the attack surface for these OT and IoT devices. Even if it is a legacy system, which cannot be patched, if it is not visible to the attackers, so then basically you are obviously protected against a huge attack surface. Now, the only case where these devices can then be attacked would be an insider case. Say the attacker was able to compromise one of the users from that organization, and that using that user's machine, they're able to launch a target against this OT device, which they are able to reach using the network. So that will be the only use case. And that too can be protected by segmentation and making sure that the access policies are put in place so that no the only users who need to access the device have access to those devices.
Okay, well, that's encouraging. I always have thought that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So,
Yep.
getting ahead of it is good. I would love to just mention again that QR code there for anyone to access this report. Will, when someone gets this report, you've given such a great summary of it in this call today. Can you say a little bit more about how they get this and what people might be using it for?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you want to download the report, you can obviously use this QR code here or navigate to the Zscaler site where it's available. And I think this report, there's just a lot more data around different IoT device trends and different industry trends, different geographical trends. We get a much deeper dive on different types of malware that we're seeing evolve and around best practices. So I think anyone can use this report to just get a much more comprehensive view of the threats that might be impacting IoT.
Okay, amazing. I hope everyone does that. And thank you all so much for being here. Jitin and Will, thank you for sharing your time and knowledge. We'll see y'all next time. Bye bye.